here's the thing about anxiety at work. It really was a wonderful exercise, understanding anxiety in the workplace is, your top achievers are almost always your most anxious. And they're the ones that you don't worry about, that you should worry about, right? Because they never say no to anything. They'll never miss a deadline. They never want to disappoint you, right? They won't eat, they won't sleep, right? They'll do that. So, in our group, in the 100 Coaches, is a wonderful thought leader, Michael Bungay Stanger. And he wrote a tremendous book called The Coaching Habit. And what the coaching habit teaches you is ask good questions and listen. And one of his questions, he's got 7 basic questions, but one of the questions that you can use to tamp down anxiety is, if you say yes to this, what are you saying no to? It's a question we don't often ask as leaders. Your work, your life is kind of like a container ship, right? You can only put so many containers on the ship, and if you keep adding more, you sink the ship, right? So this idea of, look, if we say yes to this, what are we saying no to? So in other words, what container are we taking off to put this one on? And those questions, I think, are very helpful. One of the other tactics that a counselor shared with us that I think is brilliant is you don't go up to your people and say, by the way, Sophie, I read this book, Anxiety at Work, and you check all the boxes. You're anxious, aren't you? That never works. What they suggest is, how do you start the conversation? How do you make it safe to talk about mental health? And the tool that they gave us, I think, is brilliant. And the way you start the conversation is you say, you know what, Sophie, I noticed. You start the conversation with, I noticed. I noticed that for someone who's never late, lately you've had a tough time showing up on time. When I say I notice, your brain translates that to I care. And if I know you care about me, I feel safer to talk to you about anxiety and mental health. So those 2 tools in a manager's toolbox go a long way to identifying, are they anxious and how can I help? Which is another great question, right? I've noticed that it's been hard for you to get to work on time. How can I help? Can we adjust your schedule? Are there some things going on? So those 2 little tactics I find are really brilliant. If we say yes to this, what are we saying no to? I've noticed, how can I help? You open it up, you make it safe. Another tactic that's really wonderful when you're asking questions is, there are a lot of books that start with why. Why do we work? What's our purpose? Michael says, substitute why with what. Because if your tone isn't quite right with why, you put people on the defensive. Sophie, why did you do that? Instead of, what were you hoping the outcome was going to be? What were you hoping was going to happen? Now it's more of a teaching moment. It's more of a coaching moment, as opposed to scapegoating. Why would you do that? That's crazy. Why would you embarrass me like that? You see what I'm saying? Again, creating these safe spaces. The key to asking good questions, and I always say, look, really good leaders are good listeners. And the way you become a good listener is you ask good questions. And then after you ask it, you listen, you get quiet. We want to give all our advice. We want to share our wisdom. And sometimes we shut down the conversation as opposed to, so what were you hoping the outcome would be? Quiet. Listen. What can I do to help? Quiet. That's really helpful.